Hello and welcome everyone. This is Talk of the Town and I am James Milan. And today we are here at Arlington High School with the Director of Guidance and Social Emotional Learning for Pre-K through 12, Sara Fernandes Burd. Sara, thanks so much for taking the time to invite us into your office
Absolutely.
today and introduce yourself to the Arlington community, because as it turns out, this position is a brand new position within the schools and an important one, and part of a general move and project that we want to talk about in greater detail. But one of the things we always like to do on Talk of the Town, especially with somebody who is new to a position in town, is to give you a chance to just explain to our audience, let us know a little bit about what your own journey has been to get you to this particular position.
Thank you. Absolutely. So I myself am an Arlington resident, which I'm going to say right off the bat because it's one of the major elements that brought me to the position. Previous to accepting the job here in Arlington, I was working in Reading Public Schools, just in Reading, Mass, for about 7 years as their Director of Social Emotional Learning, and loved it. It was a fantastic gig. And then when Arlington created this position, I couldn't in any good conscience say no, because it's really fantastic to be working in my own community. And personally, I also have a daughter that's in preschool, and I'm excited to be working in the system where she's going to be. So that's really exciting. And before that, I was out in Fitchburg, and then before that in Boston Public Schools. So I got my start as an educator in the urban schools. I was a school adjustment counselor, a guidance counselor, and I got my clinical license as a registered drama therapist. So when I like to work with families and with students in the communities and even our own staff, I like to bring in a lot of expressive arts elements as well. And you might hear me use some analogies and things along those lines because I like to think creatively. But I definitely have enjoyed working pre-K, kindergarten, elementary school in Brooklines, middle and high schools in Boston, middle and high school in Fitchburg. So I've had a lot of fun seeing the whole developmental span.
Yeah, and I have to say, it sounds like a very big job. Just considering the title, we were talking about pre-K through 12, the entire school population, really. And then Director of Guidance, I think people are somewhat familiar with what kind of things are involved with that, and we can talk about that more. But I particularly want to draw attention to social emotional learning, which is a field unto itself and may or may not be familiar to our audience. So, as you said, Arlington just created this position, yet it has been, around for a while. You were working in Reading for 7 years. Can you tell us about the field of social emotional learning?
So depending on your introduction to the field and the work itself, you might call it by a million other different names. You might call it interpersonal skills, non-cognitive skills, soft skills was a really big one for a while. Things like grit, perseverance, resilience, character, trustworthiness, trying to think of all the different growth mindset. There are a million different ways that people are trying to break down and study the skills and the elements of what makes us human and how we acquire new information and how we interact with other people. And so on the whole, if you were to put a big umbrella over that, that is the field of social emotional learning. Anything that's about how we learn socially, how we learn ourselves, how we learn to identify, manage, and maximize our own potential emotionally, and how that all applies to learning is the field.
Let's clarify there that it is certainly not in contrast to other forms of learning, to the book learning that we're all familiar with as part of the school experience. One of the things, though, that strikes me just about that, and again, I'm anticipating something that may make more sense for us to talk about later in the conversation. You let me know. And that is, how is success measured in the area of social emotional learning?
Oh, that's a really great question, because I would want to pose back to you, well, how do we define success as a society? And that's something that I think as I continue to spend time in this field, we're always refining and revisiting our own definition of success. Maybe we started defining success by looking at academic achievement or acceptances into colleges or income, revenue once you're graduated and out, and purchasing a home and having the 2.5 kids in the picket fence with the dog kind of a thing, or cat, depending on what kind of a person you are. But I think even now, as a global society, we're revisiting that concept of success. There are a lot of people who have that and don't feel fulfilled. and happy and joyful and peaceful. And there are a lot of people who do have that and find that there. I think success, what we really want and what we hope for, not just in Arlington, but everywhere, is that our young people are able to have the skills and the abilities to take whatever their world and whatever their life is going to hand them and find a way of navigating it with ease, with grace, with resources, and the ability to navigate anything and everything that comes at you. And it's going to be unpredictable. We know that from our content areas. We got to train in technology for technology we don't even know exists yet. We have to prepare students for jobs that don't even exist yet. So similarly, the one thing that they'll always have is themselves, right? Their own body, their own health and well-being. And if we can give them a tool set that is variable and it's able to move with the shifting winds of our world, then that would be success from my perspective. And ideally that they're able to find some fulfillment in whatever path they choose and however they navigate it.
Well, just to pursue that a little bit further, it strikes me very strongly that this work that you're describing is going to have a greater impact on most students who come through this system as they move through their lives than whatever the academic content is that they were picking up and regurgitating. And I speak as a former teacher,
Sure.
But I understand that a lot of it is that students will absorb a lot of information for the time period that they need to absorb it and get it back out so that the teacher can see that that's the case, and you move on to the next class and the next year, et cetera. And what you hold on to in those ways is very ephemeral in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. What you're describing are life skills that are going to play out for people for the rest of their lives. So in that sense, it seems like that's among the most important work that educators can do. At the same time, it seems to run very counter to the need seen in our educational system at the moment to measure and quantify and show, in data or numbers or results or something like that. How does SEL, how does social emotional learning, how do you navigate within this field that kind of, that potential collision?
I don't think of it as a collision. I think of it, this is going to sound trite, but as an opportunity. So to revisit one of your previous points that you just mentioned about old school regurgitation, memorization, spitting out facts for facts' sake, that is fortunately not how we do business here, which is phenomenal because, as I had mentioned earlier, we're going to do the SEL work really, really well if it is inherently integrated with the academic work that's happening, right? So I don't remember myself a lot about history, right? But I do remember this really poignant lesson that my history teacher in, I think it was 10th grade, did with us. And it was this fusion. In hindsight, I look back at it and I go, oh, it was a fusion of SEL and history born together. And it was looking at this survey of what kind of a society would you ideally like to live in. And you answered questions about allocation of resources and distributed leadership and what a typical day would look like and so on. And by the end, it told you, are you fascist? Are you democratic? Are you in an oligarchy? Are you monarchy? Whatever it might be. And most of us came up communist, actually. And I will always remember that, thinking that this is a huge lesson not only in figuring out who we are and the values we hold, how we want to engage in our world, but then how that's currently being played out in the whole global sphere and historically how it's played out. And it was this amazing moment where I will never forget that lesson and what came with it. But it also wasn't me sitting in a room just practicing social emotional skills. It was this really creative blend of the two. And that is ideally where we are in so many places. I know it already is because I've seen it happening. But it's also how can this position and this work help teachers to really bring their lessons to life in that way so that they're leaving these indelible memories. They are being applied in a way that kids are learning things that are vastly deeper than what's in the textbook or the computer in front of them.
I'm thinking, before we went on camera, we were talking a little bit about the fact that these kinds of programs, social emotional learning programs or curricula or however it is that you want to describe it, are happening in communities all around the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
But they're happening at the community level. With the focus being on, hey, what works best in Reading, what works best in Arlington, et cetera. Is there any sense, are you aware of and are you potentially involved with an effort to leverage all of these communities' experience in some way that of course would benefit the larger state population, perhaps even national, with lessons learned and again shared experience, and is that happening at the same time as these projects are going on?
Yes, it's all happening simultaneously. So back a couple of years ago, there was the creation of an organization in Massachusetts called the Social Emotional Learning Alliance for Massachusetts. So SEL4 mass.org, and they're out there, and they decided to be a statewide group that would really pull together, knowing that the sprawling nature, acknowledging the sprawling nature of the work. They said, let's see if we can be a hub for people to come to learn more about it, to find a way to actively support the work, to advocate for policy change, to seek funding when necessary. And so they do exactly that. They pull together business folks from the community, students, parents, providers for mental health services, higher ed. They've even pulled in a lot of local universities to say, how do we need to change teacher prep programs so they can come in learning about social emotional learning and not having to just learn it on the job. And SEL for Mass really pulls together all of those folks. So a number of years ago, I joined up with them, became a part of the steering committee, and have been working with them to try to pull together folks who have my job or at sometimes in their week put my hat on. And it is challenging, it's a moving target, but we're starting to go through them and it's been really exciting. We had a job-alike group of about 10 folks from different communities. And they don't all have this name. They're not all director of SEL. Some of them are special ed directors, but they see real value in making sure social emotional learning happens for all students because it actually helps their special education programming and services too. So you have some folks coming to the table from there. We have nurse leaders who are coming to the table seeing it as primary prevention and how do they approach it. We have teacher leaders, we have principals, we have social workers and psychologists, we have BCBAs. They all have different roles and backgrounds, and Wilmington has a role, Stoneham has a role, Reading has a role, Everett has someone there, Newburyport has somebody there. So all these different communities call them completely different things, but we start to run into each other at all the same trainings, start to know all the same people, and said, hey, let's get together and have a job-alike group so we can learn from each other's expertise, pool some resources, and make sure that we're not missing something because we're the only person in our district or our region doing the work. There was a more formalized effort in Massachusetts to create something called the EXSEL network, and it's EXSEL because it's an SEL alliance of a number of the professional organizations in the Commonwealth. So you have Massachusetts superintendents, their group, their school committees, professional group, the secondary and elementary principals groups, all of these different professional organizations came together and said, we really need a network of schools that are doing this work in terms of SEL that we can go to as other communities of practice. We can visit, we can learn from, we can have conferences and convenings. So they've also started up just this past year an effort to create a community of practice for SEL work. And that's not necessarily the role of the person, but rather the district's participation, which is great. And on a wholesale effort, at the state level, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has a task force for creating safe and supportive schools. But ultimately what it means is it's a representation of stakeholders from across state agencies, not just education, and representatives from different areas and regions of the state. And different roles. So you have, again, nurse leaders, you have school committee, you have teachers, you have union representation, you have students, you have a lot of folks at the table. And what we do there is we meet regularly and talk about how does the department and the state create opportunities for the social emotional learning to really take hold. And where does social emotional learning interface with trauma sensitive schools and anti-bullying and equity and diversity and all of the other really poignant elements that are coming up in education. I sit on that task force, and I've been a member since the 2008. And so when I was first on that group, I was a school counselor, and speaking from the role of being an adjustment counselor and a guidance counselor, this is what we need to create safe and supportive schools. And over the years, as I've taken on this role, they have me there as somebody who was one of the original authors of the framework that we use for the self-assessment tool that we used in the district, and to help figure out how do we bring this to scale? How does it become really helpful for schools so that they can access it no matter where they are? So that's where I think I got my training in translation. It was figuring out how do we take all of this conversation in a boardroom in a way that's actually useful for the folks who are in the trenches all the time.
Let me ask you
Yeah.
just to briefly tell us, where does Massachusetts, as you just said,
Yeah.
ton going on at the state level. So where does Massachusetts fit in the context of the country?
Nationally, I'm really excited to say that the work that we're doing in Massachusetts is appropriate for our context and the way that our state runs. And we're being asked to do a lot of things nationally to try to help just share our experiences so that if there are other districts or states that are finding themselves similarly situated, they don't have to recreate the wheel. So currently, something I'm really thrilled about, I actually get to serve on the Council of Distinguished Educators on the National Commission for Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. That commission consists of, I believe, about 30 educators from across the country. And I believe there are 2 or 3 of us from Massachusetts alone, which is awesome because you don't have people from every state. And so to be represented in triplicate is really phenomenal. We are there to speak to our experiences and how things are going in Massachusetts. Equally, though, we're joined by educators from Alaska. There's a 2nd grade teacher from Alaska who comes to all of the meetings in DC, and he talks about what it's like to be in the trenches. And Alaska, very different from Massachusetts, they have state standards in social emotional learning. So just like we have frameworks for math and ELA, and you need to make sure that all of them have been reached by the time students graduate and they're proficient, we don't have them for social emotional learning outside of pre-K and K. Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, we actually have state standards in social emotional learning for pre-K and K, but they stop there. And there's guidance on how to include them, but we don't have them fully developed. Anchorage has them. Anywhere else in Alaska has them, and a number of other states do. But it's really fascinating to take that experience and our experience and sit down nationally and say, what's the gold standard? And I'll tell you right now, the answer, you're not going to be told one or the other because of local context, because of local governance, because of all of the other mitigating factors. But that's part of why we're both at the table. Massachusetts does a fantastic job with their policy. On the books and legally, we have a hugely supportive state legislature. They go to bat for us whenever we need to. Every time we go for testimony, they're always highly supportive. They're always trying to support us. And the Department of Education is always trying to do that as best as they can too. I don't know that standards are going to be something that really works for Massachusetts. It doesn't seem to fit our culture at the moment. But in Alaska, it really fit their culture. They went for it, and it was really a fantastic process for them. So at this moment in time, it's really awesome to have those folks at the table in the room to talk about the pros and cons of one approach versus the other. And again, you're dealing with human beings and human skills, and so it's always going to be a variable moving point. It's not going to be something that's isolated.
And I can imagine that the results of the shared information going on in those contexts is going to mean sometimes that Massachusetts can recognize, oh, this works in Alaska, but just doesn't work for us, and it's not even worth an effort. A lot of the time, though, it's going to need to be a trial, a trial and error kind of basis, see how it goes.
Or see what resources we have, right? That's the other thing with going back to the strengths-based approach is we know our legislature is a really strong place to go, so we're really strong in policy. New Jersey has just done a lot of great stuff with their state policy as well. They have some really great connections from higher ed and their government as well locally there. But it all depends on your resources, what you're ready for, and it's exciting to travel that systems approach. Mm-hmm. With the National Commission, it's really exciting because in November of 2018, there's going to be a report out to the nation on the state of social, emotional, and academic development in the country.
When did you say that was?
November of 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully, fingers crossed. Mm-hmm. They've been phenomenal. And if you want to check out a number of their resources, the Aspen Institute hosts the website with all of this. And they've put out amazing briefs. They have brought together the most amazing minds. So I had mentioned I'm on the Council of Distinguished Educators. There's a whole separate council for scientists. They have taken the top researchers in the country, pulled them together and said, okay, coming back to your initial question, right? How do you measure this seed or this cell stuff? And you've got all of the amazing authors of all of the amazing studies out there sitting at the table and telling you, this is what I've done, this is what you've done, comparing, contrasting. You've got Harvard, you've got Yale, you've got Johns Hopkins, you've got so many all of the beautiful places on the West Coast that, of course, because I'm a New Englander, I don't know them all. But it's incredible because they're all sitting at the table talking about the merits of how we can get better at this. And at the end of the day, they're always thinking, how do we make it accessible to educators? So their group and our group get together and talk about what's helpful from the research, what do practitioners need? And really, I've never been in a forum that's pulled together those two sides of the coin. So in terms of how Massachusetts is doing, a number of the scientists are from Massachusetts as well. So it's beautiful to see not only do we have practitioners represented, but we also have scientists represented. And we are able even locally to work with one another to continue to improve and pilot in our own backyard, in our own Massachusetts schools, the things that we're talking about nationally to see how they play out locally. It's really exciting.
But let me ask, just for you to push forward a little bit in your mind. You pick the time frame. Maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10. Sure. Where do you see or hope to see things at here in Arlington in terms of the work that you've taken on?
That's a good question. I'll go with like 5-7 years down the line. I would love to see, I want to start young and be able to build older while simultaneously helping all of our adults, right? It would be phenomenal if in 5 or 7 years that you had this culture shift in terms of common language, so that when we're talking about SEL and when we're talking about social, emotional, and academic development, people understand that they are fully one and the same, and that one begets and needs the other in order to be successful. They don't exist separately. Once that mind shift, once it clicks, things start to ripple out from that. Lessons start to take on a slightly different hue, starting to pull in the social emotional learning competencies. So ideally in 5 or 7 years, you would end up with curriculum maps that simultaneously pull together the SEL competencies with the academic standards. You'd end up with parent-teacher conferences looking like a conversation, which you see a lot in the earlier grades, but maybe less so as you get further on, where you're not talking about classroom disruption, you're not talking about executive functioning challenges, but rather you're looking at, here are your students' social emotional learning competencies and how we're building them in class, and this is how you can work on them at home too. Sometimes we talk about things punitively. You would see a shift. You would see it as, they just haven't learned that yet. We're working on that. And here's a way you can work on it at home. Thinking about how do we get all of the pockets of the SEL work that are already happening and pull them together so that everyone knows what's happening, because it's often happening behind closed doors, or somebody had a passion project that was really great, but someone in a different building across the town didn't know it was happening, so didn't benefit from that learning. How do we make sure that those are accessible to all of our students, regardless of what school you go to? It doesn't mean they all need the same program, but they all need to have access to a high quality program, regardless of what building you're in. So in those 5 years, we'll have that. We'll have equitable access for every student. We'll have really incredible, exciting programming that exists outside of academic content so they can learn them, but also integrated within it, so that your whole day is encapsulated with opportunities to learn in social and emotional settings. Mm-hmm. And we'll end up with educators that are really feeling the buoyancy from that, and families as well. Things are going to be, people feel really empowered by their ability to take some agency and control over these social emotional learning skills. We'll see the connection between the SEL skills and the mental health crisis that we see, and that if we really start embedding opportunities early on, and there's no stigma to talking about any of this, we'll end up with less crises on the tail end, and we'll end up with more resources readily available so we can intervene faster. That's what I'm hoping to see in about 5 or 7 years. Some less numbers on mental health issues, higher numbers in terms of access and programming, general health and well-being of staff and employees feeling like they got a handle on it in a common language that's really permeated outside of these walls.
Well, it's almost impossible for me to resist asking this question, which really asks you to expand it. If it's possible to expand this even further, let me just ask. We are clearly at a moment in the world as it is right now and in our country in which civil discourse and civility itself seem like endangered species in some ways. how can this kind of experience through one's school age years find a reflection in that world, this world of polarization and vitriol, etc.?
That's a great question. And you're making me realize that we're going to have new history standards coming out actually in Massachusetts that focus on civics. And so I think in education as a whole, you're seeing this desire for us to learn in context of the larger society. You know, we talk about project-based learning and how do you do something that's multi-stepped with group members and the group dynamics that are challenging, and there's no price that can be put on learning amongst other people who are simultaneously trying to learn, and how that experience is priceless compared to anything else. And once we move towards more of that, as we continue to, you end up with people who can engage in a world where they're realizing, if I'm feeling anxious about seeing that boss that's giving me a hard time, I can't just unplug. I have to be there. And I have to find a way then to be there and be okay about it, or find other supports outside that are going to help me be okay with it. And that comes back almost all the way back to your initial question about thinking about the application of these skills and what we're going to do with them. And success would look like a globe, an entire globe, or maybe someday universe, where you end up with every human being feeling like no matter what the world is going to offer them politically, environmentally, economically, thinking about, I know how to engage with this, or I feel like if I don't have the skill, I have the skill to get somebody to help me with it, to ask for help with it, to find the resources. You know, it used to be that people would come to school to get information. And the internet blew up and our world changed around us. And now young people don't come to school to get information. If they want to know how to do something, how to dissect a frog, they can do that all virtually. They don't need us for that. But what they do need us for is to figure out who they are in context of the world around them. And so if we can get our young people to come to school and figure out, okay, this is where my locker is, this is what my class course load is, these are who my peers are, this is what's going on in the world around me. And I have the skill set to figure out and navigate all of that and come out okay. And I can do that on a day that I'm sick. I can do that on a day where I'm stressed and have a million exams, or I have no sleep. I can do that on a day that we win the championship for the hockey team. I can navigate all of these emotions and all of my terrain in my life right now. That's the success for our young people, which then translates to, okay, they go out into society, and no matter who their neighbors are, no matter who their local government agent folks are, no matter who their national government looks like, no matter what their bank account looks like, no matter what their health and well-being looks like, they can know that they've had the training and the practice and the skill set to be able to navigate all of that and find a way where maybe previously there wasn't one. And I can't speak for what the world's going to look like when our kids graduate, and when my daughter's out in the world. I can have heart palpitations thinking about the cost of college. But what I do know is that we'll find something, we'll find a way, we'll be resilient. She will do the same. I have no idea what college is going to look like for her, or if it's even going to be a thing. But however she's going to be learning, and however she's going to be navigating the world, if we can focus on the social emotional learning, then anything that comes at her, she'll find something, some way to navigate it.
All right, well, reluctantly, we need to let you get back to your job, because you have, as we've already noted, more than enough to do. Appreciate your time. We look forward to checking back in with you in the near future and the further future, just to make sure that things are proceeding apace as we hope they will be.
Thank you.
Good luck with everything. For Sara Burd, our Director of Guidance and Social Emotional Learning for every student in our school system, I'm James Milan. This is Talk of the Town. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.